For thou within, no walls confined, in happy test the humble mind, such ever bring thee when they come, and going take thee to their home. Lord, we are few, but thou art near, nor short thine arm, nor deaf thine ear. O rend the heavens, come quickly down, and make 1,000 hearts thine own. Today we've come to a strange place on this strange journey they call life. So good morning, everyone, and I sincerely hope that if you're able to listen to this now or later on, it will be as relevant then as it will be, I hope, now, and trust. So good morning, and hope you're all well. Hope you've had as good a night as it is possible to have. I'm here this morning with Mr. Rutherford, Jr., and it's my privilege to work with him. It's strange, isn't it? The reading, like all Anglican services, is never chosen by the priest. They are simply there, and just every now and then they are the right readings, and this day is no exception. John chapter 11, that familiar story of Lazarus. The Lazarus story of two sisters and the mourners as they gather when their brother and a friend had died. And despite its familiarity, there's always something that comes out of these stories that reminds you of God's timelessness. So Jesus' apparent refusal to come when they needed him, that moment when two sisters needed Jesus to be on hand and he wasn't there. There's something quite irritating about this passage. I always find it irritating because it is almost as if Jesus was deliberately, and of course he was, the way John writes this, Jesus was deliberately waiting. It's a case to be proven that death was not going to have the last word. And so as we reread this passage and remember that in it we have people who were grieving, and not unlike what we're experiencing today, we personally may not be experiencing grief, but we know that throughout this land, throughout Europe, and indeed throughout the world, people are grieving. And there's something that is timeless about this story of the Christ who apparently took his time, no sense of urgency, and yet we are at the moment living with a great sense of urgency. Jesus delayed his coming to see Mary and Martha in the presence of death. For us, it is urgent. It appeared as if it wasn't for Jesus. But as we will see later on, here Jesus eventually presents himself with the mourners. And as I said earlier, I did not choose this reading. It's the reading set for this week. Here Jesus uses the occasion to show something about the nature of what it means to be him, to be the Christ, the Jesus who profoundly understood this human experience between Mary, Martha, and of course her friends who came to mourn with her at the death of her brother. It seemed like a risky strategy on Jesus' part to wait until Lazarus was dead. There was something ugly about death that we don't want to think about. It is not surprising that they were startled when Jesus attempted and eventually did open the grave. We don't want to face the ugliness of death. And yet this story is a constant reminder that death cannot be hidden from. And Jesus almost deliberately allows them to see this ugliness. And it is not surprising as well that, the sister said, even now I know it isn't too late. Jesus took advantage of this situation because he knew that this was going to be a costly moment. Because the moment he did what he did, they were after him to kill him. So it's always risky. Jesus took risk. So John chapter 11, it's worth revisiting. This reading reminds us of Jesus who is the bringer of life. That in the midst of this death scene, with sisters grieving, this week and the week ahead of me, I have many funerals to take. And I will see a lot of grief, a lot of people who are in mourning. Members of our own congregation have suffered and are suffering from the reality of death and the ugliness and timelessness and ill-timed death. And as I face those realities next week, I won't be that different to Mary, Martha, and her family as they grieve the death of their brother and a friend. In the week ahead, I'll be taking these services where people will grieve their loved ones. But Jesus enters into this death, despite its untidiness and despite all the grief and the ugliness. There was a sense that Jesus was angry, that death has this enormous power over us. And even if we do not appreciate it or admit to it, there is something scary about death. And I just wonder if that's why Jesus was cross. There was a crossness about him. And we're told that he wept. He showed emotions. And when I read it this morning, when I reread this chapter, it's a familiar chapter for me. And yet I've never really totally emotionally understood this moment of Jesus' own anger. There's his emotion. It's not so much anger, but there was a sense in which he seemed to have been angry with death. The death that rules the thinking of humanity. It has this hold over us, this fear. And Jesus' impatience, do you not believe, Mary, do you not believe that I am the resurrection and the life? So there was an attempt to for me anyway, to pretend that Jesus' humanity was of no significance here. It was. Jesus showed himself as being totally human. He didn't cover up his own rage against death, and the reality of dying. He faced it. He didn't welcome it, but he certainly didn't run away from it. And I just love the fact that Jesus dared to be human. And it is in our humanity. It is those moments when we can acknowledge not only our own humanity, Jesus' own weeping, his own moments of, being swept away by the familiar and unfamiliar emotions of what it means to be Jesus. So Jesus himself was moved, and we're told he was moved to tears, and he stood there in the midst of grief. And many of you, not least the Rutherford family, and certainly not least Mrs. Said and her family, had this difficult time, and the many funerals I shall take, that in the midst of the uncertainties and yet certainties of life, this humanity, this Christ who dared to be human, not only because he was crucified and died, but he faced his own emotions and his own rage at the untidy nature of death, and sometimes the untimely one as well. So with the weeping of our Lord, and yet the Lord who said to the family, I am the resurrection and the life. Do you believe this, Mary? Of course, says Mary with some degree of certainty. Of course I believe this, Lord. This Jesus, who moves among us today in this untidy place we call earth. This untidy place of grief, uncertainties, fears, the anxiety of wanting Jesus to be here and probably not being certain that he's around when we need him most. But one thing the story tells us, that Jesus is involved in the untidiness of our lives, in the untimely death of loved ones, in the human experience. Today we can remember that even we, in our uncertainties, can remind ourselves that Jesus is a God who says, I am the resurrection and I am the life. I hope this morning this will bring some hope amidst our worry, our concerns and our anxieties, that this Christ, who appears to be not very good at timekeeping, is here with us in our hour of need. God bless you, church. I love you. Have a good day. The Lord be with you. Amen.